everyone. Thank you so much for watching another episode of the Weaviate Podcast. We've got another awesome one diving into agent experience. Firstly, I'm super excited to be joined by two members of the Weaviate team making his debut on the Weaviate Podcast. I'm super excited to welcome Sebastian Witalec, Director of Education and Developer Experience at Weaviate. Sebastian's been one of the core leaders of Weaviate from an extremely early stage, doing all sorts of things with the development of Weaviate, including a super awesome collaboration with Andrew NG. Sebastian, thank you so much for joining.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me. I've always been watching your podcast, but this is my chance to actually say something smart. Hopefully, I will succeed. We'll see.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sebastian. And I'm also super excited to welcome Charles Pierse, Director of the Innovation Labs team at Weaviate, back to the podcast again. Charles, thanks so much for joining.
Thanks, Connor. Good to be back. I think I'm starting to rack up some appearances now, so I'm going to go for that second place medal after you.
Yeah, of our analytical query on. Awesome. And rounding out the roster for our podcast on agent experience, we have the man of the hour, Matt Biilmann, co-founder and CEO of Netlify. Matt's article, Introducing AX, Why Agent Experience Matters, really struck a chord with us, and we couldn't be more excited for this opportunity to discuss it with you and learn more about all the awesome work you're doing at Netlify. Matt, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me. Great being here.
Awesome. So I know probably we're a bit about how Charles and Sebastian are approaching this, but Matt, I'd love if you could kind of kick us off by explaining your journey at Netlify and your perspective on these things.
Yeah, I mean, for context, Netlify is a front end web platform that helps developers build, deploy, and operate any kind of web property, right? Like we launched now almost 10 years ago in March 2015, at a time where the way you typically build web properties was these monolithic applications where the front end layer was kind of like an afterthought inside a backend framework at sometimes, right? Like, and back in that time, I coined this term Jamstack for this idea of decoupling the front end from the back end and starting to treat the web experience layer as its own application. And we saw that if you did that and started using headless CMSs and different headless APIs for content, data, and commerce and transactions and everything, then you would have like dedicated teams just building the front end experiences. And there would be an opportunity to build a whole new set of tooling for that workflow just centered around building the web experience. So Netlify kind of invented this whole front end cloud approach of coupling together the idea of global CDN, not just as a proxy in front of something, but as like the hosting and the deployment layer tightly integrated into Git operations platforms where developers would naturally be working. And we focused really obsessively around the idea of developer experience, right? Like if you are building this kind of front end experience, how do we make the path from writing your code to having something running live in production on a URL the shortest possible, right? Like, and how do we really make that experience feel unintrusive and intuitive? How do we meet developers in the tools they are already using in GitHub and VS Code and their command line, and really like give them this sense that Netlify is frictionless for them and is there to help them. And that has sort of powered our growth from when we launched till today, where we've onboarded almost 6 million developers to the platform, with more than 5,000 developers signing up every day. We are like the site stores and apps running on our global edge network reaches more than 1 billion unique visitors every month, is spanning every kind of web experience you can imagine, from hobbyist portfolio sites all the way to massive e-commerce properties, things like Vans, North Face, or like global companies like Unilever.com, or application software like Navan software, right? Like, so any kind of use case, any kind of scale, and so on. And as we started seeing the whole change happening in the world around Gen AI, and I started formulating sort of our strategy to that. A lot of companies started to focus obviously on how Gen AI is going to start building more and more of the code and writing, playing a more and more active role in these web experiences. And I always felt that like Netlify's role had never been to like come to developers and say, this is how you should build your stuff. It had always been about like when you build it, we'll get it live instantly, we'll scale it, we'll make that whole path frictionless, right? Like, so I started looking in the same way, if AI start building this, how do we do that for them, right? Like I started this strategy of like, how do Netlify become the best deployment platform for AIs, and what does it mean? How is it going to work, right? Started out retooling some of our earlier flows specifically for AI agents. We when the GPT assistant layer emerged in ChatGPT, we built a Netlify GPT that you can install, and if you've installed that, then anywhere in the GPT ecosystem you can just add mention Netlify and deploy whatever you have to a URL, and really focused on this frictionless path for an agent in the same way that we'd focused on a frictionless path for a user. So it meant like no extra sign up step or anything like that. Just get it on a URL, and if the user likes it, they can go claim it and add it to their own account. And if not, it can just be an ephemeral URL that goes away after a couple of hours, right? Started giving tooling for other people building agents to instantly like add that flows. Saw a couple of other GPTs like Grimoire in the ChatGPT ecosystem. Devin from Cognition Lab was an early adopter and started deploying to Netlify, and latest Bolt has done a really great integration into Netlify that we are now also sort of really learning from and saying like, okay, what do we need to improve? And it was as we were on this journey of working with these agents that I coined this term agent experience, that has really helped us internally in thinking about this as a new discipline in a way, right? Like in a similar way that we had user experience as the first take on this, right? Like that was really seeing, okay, as a user of a product, there's a holistic experience of this product. That's everything that goes into like how does it appeal to me? How is the brand? How is my interactions? How does this product serve me? How does it work? Right? Like for developers, we started focusing on the same way of a developer experience. That's not just like the product itself, but the documentation around it, the CLI tooling, how intuitive is it to understand and build on top of that product. And we started seeing, okay, we really need a new term around agent experience that sort of really centered on the holistic experience of Netlify, right? Like how easy are the flows to act on behalf of a user, right? Like because agents are always, they're autonomous in their driving, but they're hopefully always doing something because some human somewhere wants them to do something, right? Like so you have to have some of those levers for agents to do work on behalf of someone, or in collaboration with someone. They understand, like, it's interesting that we have this whole set of APIs that we think of as made for machines, but in reality, they're made for developers to write machine code, and they're not necessarily just that they're not written today for agents. So we need to start thinking about like what is the best way to structure your programmatic interface in a way that's really great for an LLM driven agent, right? Like, and it won't be the same as what's the best for a developer to write a workflow based on coupling two tools together, right? Like it's more like a UI in the sense that the agents want sort of to instantly work and do things, and they probably need to be structured and documented differently, right? Like, so we've sort of eternally really aligned the next phase of Netlify around the same level of obsession over agent experience as we had in sort of the first 10 years of Netlify around developer experience. And it's not to give up on developer experience, but I just think that inherently in a few years, you won't be able to deliver good developer experience if you're not delivering great agent experience, because every developer will be using different agentic tooling to build and work on their projects.
I really love how you explain this and how you look at it, right? Because on one side, like me as a developer, my thinking is like, oh yeah, you mentioned the ChatGPT plugin and everything. If I have a service, it's not a big deal. I could just go there and rewrite the plugin. But I think the whole idea is that what if you don't have to rewrite that plugin? And there's not just ChatGPT. There's so many other kind of LLMs out there. So could I write my software in such a way so that an agent could come in, learn from whatever I'm offering and go like, oh, this is how you want me to use it. And then kind of like go through that layer of like, okay, I'm going to execute and go now. Right. And, of course, Netlify, you guys are a pretty big company and now, so you have engineers and everything, but there's plenty of small startups that don't have that bandwidth. Right. So maybe they could follow your principles, design their APIs in a certain way and provide this metadata slash agentic documentation so that the LLM could go like, oh, there is this brand new service. I'm going to learn in 1 minute and then start using it, right?
And that's relevant to another part of our thinking, right? Like, so internally at Netlify, we sort of have two tracks of work around this. One is Netlify AX. How do we make Netlify better for agents? The other is what we call industry AX, which is really like, what are all the stuff we need to figure out across the industry, not just us, right? Like, in order to build standards for these kind of things. How does better documentation for agents look like? Is it llm.txt files? Is it like um, is it a model context protocol? Is it like what are the pieces that goes into that? How do we make the stuff you can do when you have a website on like, if one of our customers builds a web app, what are the ways that an agent can discover what that web app can do for them, right? So we actually just now today rolling out a agent experience.ax as sort of an open source industry resource where we hope we can collaborate across the industry and figuring out like what is great AX, right? Like, and what goes into it. And there's both practices more similar to UX or DX practices around like understanding friction points and so on, but there's also like a protocol level side to that on like what tooling, what open standards do we need to all agree on to make life easier for these agents.
Yeah, I loved hearing your mention of llm.txt, because I guess in a way I saw that as like maybe a precursor or like an initial attempt at doing
Yeah.
AX, but it kind of still needs to go further. And like I really like this idea that all the standards that come from this, like they have to be open source, because if it's going to work, it has to be like an open source initiative and something defined at that level, because it's the only way. We don't know what models or how this game is going to play out over the next 10 years, but it's going to have to be open source with an initiative like this.
And there'll be these weird, like, everything in this space is so interesting and weird, right? Like, because there'll be this weird things that if we get a certain volume of documentation around one way, an agent should use tooling, and that starts getting indexed and including in all the agents' training set, they will be more prone to use that, right? Like, so there's all these weird random feedback loops going on in everything we do in this space.
Yeah, and that's actually something like you mentioned earlier. So you kind of have, there's like these two types of users now that you have to cater to. There's like the developer or like user, like the human user, and then there's the agent user. And there's probably a balance that still needs to be struck, especially in the short term, where you satisfy both users. Like you don't want to, if you make things too verbose or too agent oriented, it could degrade the performance for the human user or the experience, and vice versa.
And I think it's really important to always remember that, again, as I said, there's obviously a dystopian version of the world where those agents just run around and do stuff, and we've just given up in some sense, right? Like, but in any sort of like human-centered version of the world, we're building AI to do stuff for us, right? Like, in things we want. So there's typically, for any agent that are out there doing something, it's always doing it because some human like has asked it to figure something out or solve something or build something, and I think it's one of the reasons why current APIs, for example, might not be the ideal ways to always do things, because often you need the human to also be shown what is the agent doing, right? Like what is it working with, and the human might not get a lot out of seeing like a bunch of like I'm calling all these APIs and doing stuff that sounds really mysterious, right? Like, and I can try to describe you for it, but it's kind of a meta layer. It's interesting to see right now that probably most web applications that has a set of APIs, if you make an experience and on the one hand you just stuff those like the open API spec for that into ChatGPT's context and start asking it to do stuff, you will probably get much worse results from that than going to operator and asking it to do stuff through the web UI, which in reality means the operator taking like a virtual browser, taking screenshots of every step of the web UI, and then having multimodal LLM interpret that and give commands back and control the guidance and so on, right? Like really Rube Goldberg style system. But I'm pretty convinced that for most apps, that system right now will probably work better than just giving ChatGPT an open API spec and hoping it can figure it out. And part of that is because the interaction with the users are much clearer, and like the user can much better see and understand what's going on, right? Like, so I think it's again one of these examples of how, as we build out this agent experience layer, we're gonna have to figure out what that right intermediary like kind of experience for an agent that's still not just a raw set of endpoint, but an actual experience need to look like.
Yeah, maybe we want to. Yeah, I've loved all these. I love, Matt, your perspective. You seem so on the edge of all these like cutting edge interfaces, like Anthropic's Model Context Protocol, obviously the Chat GPT plugin, and or maybe it looks like an open API spec. For me, this kind of like tool definition, the JSON, like the function calling. Are you familiar
Yeah,
with that, Matt?
yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, so I think a lot about like in documentation, we'll have kind of like a copy and paste JSON tool definition. That's kind of like how I think about the yeah.
Yeah, internally, like Sean Roberts, that leads our industry AX efforts at Netlify. We've been talking a lot about discoverability of those, right? Like, again, it feels like somewhere along the road, we need to find out like a web standard for that, right? Like it should be enough. Ideally, it should be enough for an agent to know a domain, and if that domain has like actual like optimized tools for agents, there should be some way to just query that domain and get the list of available tools and descriptions like ready to use for an agent, right? Like, I think that that seems sort of intuitive that would be the right open way to do this, right? Like tying it to the idea of every domain can have a set of tools, and there should be an easy discoverable way for them. But it's going to require a lot of like cross industry collaboration if we get there, right? Like, because right now all the different agents have their own tool use implementation, and there's not sort of like a clear standard for like what should that look like across every agent. And it might be too early to have a clear standard for it, right? Like, because everybody built it, like everybody trying to get agents to use tools are also trying to figure this out, right?
But I guess in a sense, there's like an incentive as well for businesses and companies to actually like participate in the creation of this standard, because you mentioned something about, how to call in. You can call there's calling an API, and then there's calling an API like efficiently and the right way. So, if we're going to enter into
Yeah.
this agent world, we might as well like participate, because if you don't, the agent might just try and figure out a way to talk to your API and like overload it with like really inefficient and ineffective like requests. Or you could say, here's how to like not crash our servers and do this respectably.
We see a lot of that at Netlify with our customers, right? Like if you go to developers.netlify.com, you'll find a guide on how to block all AI agents from your side through edge functions and so on, right? Like, and that's not just because we think like, hey, it would be fun to write that. It's because that's like a really frequent request from customers that are experiencing like overwrites because like these AIs just start downloading all kinds of stuff or like or overloaded endpoints because they just start hitting them, and all these kind of behaviors that can suddenly happen when you just have like tons of different crawlers almost attacking your site, right? And that definitely feels like an area where better standards can get much more control back to whoever builds that side in terms of how do they want agents to use it. That if done right can be of really good, like can be of a lot of benefits to both parties.
Yeah, but I think because also like quite often we're thinking like there is an agent that then goes and talks to my resources, right? Like whether it consumes
Yeah.
the APIs or metadata or documentation. But what if what if we could have agents that talk to other agents, right? So you could have a Netlify agent, then the Weaviate agent talks to your agent. You know the kind of story. Get your agent to talk to my agent, and we'll get sorted out, right? And they could actually communicate with each other in a completely different language that is a lot more efficient or done in a very different way. Yeah, and there's so much we can do that we didn't think about in the past when we were like human interact with documentation or APIs, but agents to agents could be yet a different thing, right?
Yeah, definitely. I saw someone suggest that almost every REST API would end up with a /chat endpoint where where you can just use the API by chatting to it, right? Like that would kind of be also the agent to agent endpoint and so on, right? Like so I think there's things there. It gets hard when like some parts can get hard when you have two non-deterministic systems now starting to be non-deterministic together, right? It can definitely become interesting. But I think there's something to it. And I think also in smaller parts, right? Like we've been figuring out we've been considering doing stuff like this. Like for example, we have a little LLM functionality in Netlify's workflow that's centered again on helping reduce friction of building and deploying, which one probably like the most common point of friction is when a build fails for some reason. Like a developer opens a pull request, we try building it, it fails, and now that developer has to go look at build logs, look at the code, try to figure out like why did this build fail, and then fix it, right? Like it just always can end up easily gulping up like 20 minutes or something, right? So we put a little button in our UI that just says why did it fail. So it'll take the build log, the code context, run through an LLM and give you like a diagnostic and a potential solution. And that's sort of an agentic feature for our side, right? Like, but now we're starting to think, is there a good way to make that available to the agents that are starting to run builds on Netlify, right? Like, because they might want to implement all of that themselves to like, if they're doing builds on the behalf of a developer to doing all of that debugging and so on, right? Like it might be simpler if we can just give them access to our agent and ask our agent, like, why did it fail, right? Like, so there you're starting to see sort of these steps towards like agent to agent communication where you have more generalist agents that drive the whole workflow and then smaller specialized agents for solving maybe a specific problem.
Yeah, totally, right. And also, like we used to communicate in words, right? Whether they're spoken or in writing or something. But like, from my understanding, like machine learning models, they use vector embeddings as a way to communicate with each other. They wouldn't even need to talk to each other through words. They could use a completely different either language or format, or it's almost like the sixth sense that they could communicate a lot faster and also a lot more precise. Because that's one thing I've always been saying, like English is a very imprecise language. There's so much ambiguity in it. But then if you could have something that is extremely precise, the agents could actually use that to talk to each other. And then if you got like an error, you could actually very precisely go like, you need to do this. This is that went wrong. You should try that, right? there's no need for politeness or anything. It's just like, let's get this done,
But it's funny because like in the end, the agents are still like fundamentally some sort of like probability engine based on language, right? Like so it's always like in the end they aren't like first principle reasoning machines or something, right? Like they are really like predictors based on previous text and language or previous other data sets, right? Like so it's always interesting this degree to which the agents kind of still ends up meaning a step away from those kind of like when we traditionally have computers talk together, that's kind of how it works, right? Like just some interchange format and it all runs there, right? Like, but it's a good question where it will end up with agents, how much of their structure coming from being trained in humans' ways of interacting will translate into like them carrying that into computers interchanging in ways that are a bit more like humans interacting than computers interacting.
Well,
Yeah,
I
totally.
think, sorry.
Oh, go on, Connor. Yeah.
Oh, just a quick transition there. Like, I think, like we have these gRPC APIs at Weaviate that are like these like byte streams to access, and it was like one of our journeys at Weaviate is learning this evolution from GraphQL to gRPC, and yeah, exactly like Sebastian, like this idea of outputting a gRPC byte stream to query an API rather than a JSON.
Yeah. And
Yeah,
how are the
because you wouldn't
agents
even need to
currently?
think in terms of like APIs or anything. Just like straight send me the stream of, byte stream. Yeah.
Yeah, those kind of things are getting really interesting as well. I had a friend a long time ago that was working on this whole system for like before Gen AI, right? Like, but we're thinking it through the system of kind of like fundamentally changing from the concept of an API, where today we have a set of, we typically have some database, and then we have like a program in front of that with specific endpoints to do specific things, right? Like he was trying to invert it to like send a WASM through the data source, and it'll run it against it'll run that program against the data and give you back the result instead, right? Like and again, not sure, like that never really became a thing, right? Like, but maybe if we start having these AIs driving the interaction, stuff like that starts becoming really interesting. Of like, here's like this dense format of how you can write a program against our app, send it to it, we'll execute it and give you back the result, right?
Yeah, totally. But there's a scary thing about it though, because if you can have agents communicate with each other or with you in either human language or through code that you understand, you can at least have that false sense of security that you can
Yeah,
supervise it, so that they don't plot, the next Matrix move or something.
yeah.
While if they talk literally at the level that it's just beyond us, right? That could be scary, right? Like to
and
like all
and
the
also because
conspiracy
they are
theories
not
and everything going.
and also because they're not necessarily correct, right? Like I think that's another part, right? Like as humans, we kind of also in many of these things want to be able to see if the agent's actually doing the right thing, right? Like because they they're not, like often they're not, right? Like often they make mistakes and do the wrong thing or ask for the wrong data or misunderstand something, right? Like so if we don't have ways of understanding what is the agent actually doing, right?
I might.
What is going on? We have a very hard sense of like figuring out, is it actually like, if they will always give us answers with a lot of confidence, just like this is the truth, but like they're not necessarily right.
Yeah, I might say maybe you could have like a structured output where the language model outputs the query in a gRPC form, but then it also outputs a rationale in natural language. And maybe the gRPC is so efficient, like outputting the or the machine or however you encode it, right? But like some byte sequence is then decoded, and like maybe that's still a more efficient amount of tokens, right? Because like I guess it's all about like how many tokens you're getting in and out from. Yeah, cool. Well, so one other topic I really wanted to talk about was this kind of like workflow flow with agent. Like I guess there's kind of like two APIs. Like there's either like you're querying Weaviate and it's like boom, here are the responses, you're finished. But like you mentioned, Matt, with like you're building a website and you're going through like the CI/CD, or it's generally like an API that's now going to run for like 10 minutes or longer.
Yeah, I think that's the thing, right? Like that a lot of our interactions with agents, it changes the whole interaction paradigm in many ways, right? Like from these click something, get a response, right? Like to everything tends to become more async and more um more of these kind of feedback loop. I'm doing this, like now this is streaming back, now I'm waiting for this, now I'm doing this, and so on, right? Like so that's definitely like one of the follow-up articles on my AX article was from the founder of Live Blogs, sort of really sharing how they've been thinking about that, right? Like because from their perspective, part of this is gonna mean that there's often like in lots of the interfaces we build, there's gonna be agent interactions, and for that holistic experience, we're gonna have to do much more. Like almost every app is going to turn into some kind of multiplayer app, right? Like because you're going to have not other people but other agents working and doing stuff that we need to see updated and reflected and so on, right? Like at Netlify, we launched this feature called async workloads on top of our serverless functions, again because we expect that we'll see more and more of that style of programming of like spin up a request, wait for this process to finish, then when that is done, do this. But also you got to think of retries with exponential backoffs for those kind of stuff if one of them fails and so on, right? Like, and there's like just all of this plumbing that we're going to need to do to create great experiences around the way agents work, which is different from the way most of our API calls and so on traditionally have worked, right? Like that tends to be much shorter and more like do this, show if you did it, right?
Yeah, and that motivates. Well, I also just think about how much AI generally is helping educate me on how to even create the software that like runs every so often. Yeah, like async. Like it's just like pretty advanced. Like you're a pretty advanced programmer if you know how to do this kind of stuff. Yeah, and
I've been programming for a couple of decades now. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I guess like how to set up like a cron job with Kubernetes. It's like yeah, and then yeah, just this whole way of how you then integrate with the. So I guess kind of maybe one other question I wanted to ask about is your view on like the like ChatGPT might recommend a particular kind of software. Like if you don't like, so we're trying to like bring our software to ChatGPT, but if I say, hey, ChatGPT, how do I set up, say like a database, and it's like, hey, use Postgres, because it's like, hey, but what if they want to use Weaviate? Like how do you think about it?
Yeah, I mean that is really interesting, like for not just for software, for e-commerce, for everything, right? Like there's kind of like there's two sides of it, right? Like one is kind of a whole new kind of SEO, right? That's really how do you get agents to know what you are and why someone should use you, right? Becomes can end up becoming really important for businesses. Um, the the other layer, maybe the two other layers are AX on the one hand and maybe brand experience on the other hand, right? Like that also both becomes interesting, right? Like because on the AX side, my thesis is that tools that invest a lot in AX and agent experience and make a material difference in the sense of like now they are actually better to use for LLMs and agents than other tools, they will start getting like an outsized effect of the agent ecosystem sort of making that the blessed path that they've seen work for users, and that they kind of end up getting trained on this like works when I'm trying to solve this task for someone, right? Like, and they will start like that in itself will start being almost a type of SEO, right? Like, but where instead of a developer going and researching a bunch of tools, if the agent knows how to work, use and provision and set up and interact with one of them really well, they might just ending up using that tool for that reason, right? Like, because that's the point of lowest friction. And the other question becomes around like more of the brand experiences, right? Like, and here maybe more in the consumer world and so on, right? Like, but how do you actually make it worthwhile for people to go discover your web property on its own, right? Like, how do we start? Like, there'll be some pressure on us to up level the level of experiences we build there to make it worth not just asking agents questions and getting answers, but actually going and connecting with a product through a human experience, right? Like that needs to be worth our time to go there so that we build a brand relation and then like, hey, I really want agent like try out this thing because like I think it looked pretty cool, right?
Yeah, and I think we sort of think of like those agent machines as these neutral entities, right? But there is bias in it, and to be
Yeah,
fair, there should be bias to some extent. So if let's say somebody comes to like the Netlify agent, right, or to the Weaviate agent, we
yeah,
have some biases. We have certain partners we like to work with, or we have certain best practices that we want people to
yeah,
follow. Even though
yeah,
we allow you to do these four different things, but we know that one way is way better. The agent
yeah,
should be more prescriptive and biased, whether it's at the common sense and best practice level or sometimes at a commercial level. I think
yeah,
it's natural, right, that this happens, right?
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, and it will be. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd say even yeah, like I'm actually more comforted, but I guess it's like how much more different is like the agent's ability to use your tool and then create something and then get that positive feedback that maybe, somehow goes back to the gradients and causes it to use your tool more. How much does that really differ from the SEO system we already have in place where humans come use your website and they like it so that you have more, lower bounce rate and things? It's kind of the same thing, it sounds like. Yeah.
It's a very similar pattern, right? Like, but I think the search experience is just so centered around like very short-lived metrics of success in some way, right? Like where the agent experience can really be centered around did I actually like accomplish something on a behalf of a user or not, right?
That
Yeah.
that is insane. Because in a way, you could have like an agent that goes like, "Hey, I want you to go and deploy a Weaviate instance," and then they maybe go like, "Yeah, let's spin up Kubernetes, blah blah blah," and then they were like to this huge process, and then they were successful. But the next time around, they were like, "Oh, I'm just gonna create a Weaviate cloud account, set it up. Oh, I'm done after 2 minutes." So the third time you ask it to do the task, they're like, "I know two ways, but the second one was like way easier. It was pretty cheap. Yeah, I'm gonna go there."
But it's a really common problem also to be able to tell, like, again, that's where we probably in an industry need better toolings. For example, really typical problems with a lot of these code generating agents is like not knowing what certain, like, they might have a larger data training set with an older version of an API because it's been around later and not instinctively use the new version of an API that's typically like when there's a new one, it's typically because it's better, right? Like companies mostly launch new ones because they think they can improve them, right? Like, but often like the the inherent behavior of the model will almost tend to the opposite, right? Like there's a lot more in its training data from an API that's been around for a long time than from an API that's been around for a short time, right? Like, so how can we build standards like that allows us as providers to sort of really guide the agents to like this is the way you should use our system right now, right? Like forget some of your training set, right? Like and use this way because like we've figured out better ways. We sometimes run into that, right? Like and we're we of course working on supplying context files, cursor rules, and all of this, right? Like, um, but it's still, and you'll see the same, like Superbase have their like cursor rule and context files. Like Convex have done a really good job of both publishing like cursor rules and context files, but also like an eval system to figure out if your system is running it right and so on. And I think a lot of us are thinking in veins of like, how do we actually give context to the models that can make them really do the right thing? But again, it's kind of chaos of like LLM text and cursor rules and just paste this into this file and add mention it, and like there's a lack of sort of industry agreement on like what's the canonical way to solve this problem that we are all going to have.
Yeah, totally. Because I think what we're looking at now is like, if one of the examples we talked about was like, hey, we used to have this way of doing it, but now there's a newer way which is better, and we want the agents to know it. So we almost need this like a equivalent of a website redirect, right? Like, funny enough, this week I was playing with because we use Netlify at Weaviate, and I was creating a Netlify redirects which generate a code 204 that then tell all the machines and everything that from now on, this is the best way. And what I love about it is like when I talk to someone about 204, they immediately know what it means. And we need like the equivalent of 204 for agents, right? Like if an agent comes in and says like, oh, I get the A204, it's like, there is a new way of doing it. Like I should abandon it and like try the new way, right? And I think that's sort of, but we need to agree on it. Like, what is that code, right? And how you actually tell it to do it.
Yeah, there's a lot of work to be done there, and then please come participate. Like we just rolled out agent-experience.ax, right? Like as one of the places we want to try to create like a forum for discussing like what do we need for research, for articles and so on.
Yeah, I'll definitely join because this is a thing that we are discussing right now, right? Because so one of the things that my team is in charge of is our documentation, and of course we had to put a lot of effort from the SEO point of view. But SEO only solves like a tiny problem in terms of how do I make sure that this specific link is then shown as like the top search result on Google search or like any type of search. But that's not going to help me when it comes to agents, because we've gone to an exercise where we wanted to use Weaviate so that you could search through our documentation. And it wasn't so straightforward because we realized that the way we built our code wasn't very helpful for LLMs, right? So it's just kind of that thing is like, what are the special maybe meta annotation or special tags that you could have to help LLMs and agents to kind of understand and consume? And, you know, like, should they be reading straight up text, what's rendered, or should there be even like a special version of something that is like almost compiled to a different language or different format? And yeah, we're like, is anyone working on it? And I guess like this is it, right? Like this is what we need to do. Is like, how do you
this
do
is
it?
what we need to do, right? Like I think we all need that. And I heard an interesting, just like agent experience example of that from Fred, the founder of Astro, the front end framework, right? Like that are kind of saying like one thing that turned out to be interesting is that because they have built a chatbot for their docs, they've done a lot of iterations on their docs to make them work better with the chatbot. And make the chatbot get better answers, and if it doesn't give the right answers, fix the docs so when it indexes, then it gets the right answers. And that has a self-reinforcing effect of like they can iterate on that to make their docs better for LLMs. And now as they get indexed in training sets, LSMs starts becoming really good at using Astro as a framework, right? Like an Astro as a framework starts being probably often better for LLMs than many of the other alternatives out there, right? Like, and it's kind of an aspect of that. But on the flip side, I also totally agree, right? Like, docs is one of the obvious areas where it feels like we need to figure out what the best way, what the best standard way for an LLM to understand the current behavior of our system through our docs, outside of just all the iterations they might have in their training set mixed up with other people's articles and outdated, right? Like, what is the most, is it some kind of URL with the vector embeddings of the docs that they can just ask to get the exact piece they need? Is it like, what is it like, right? Like, and that's something we got to solve more than at an industry level.
Yeah. There's just so many interesting aspects of this. I guess I kind of, going into the podcast, I maybe wanted to brag about our pull requests to the Gorilla repository, which is part of the training data set for Meta's Llama models, where we have our Weaviate APIs. And I'm like, nice, we're in the training set. But now as we're talking about it, I'm kind of like, oh, well, what if we change our APIs and it's got that old knowledge? And it's like, yeah. But
I promise you, we will change APIs because, like, I keep bugging our engineers, and we do change our APIs and always improve. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that well, and maybe if I can continue on this point, there's like a lot of people, they build new data querying languages and they extend pandas, and obviously like custom SQL dialects is a big thing. Like you have like Databricks SQL, like Snow SQL, and but the model already has some prior on how to use SQL, and so it's like not going to want to use your new SQL.
It's just always also so interesting to go read like the open source version of Bold and go read like the prompt in there, right? Like there's just something really fascinating about reading these prompt with all of their important. You must never like do this and treat it as really important. And I mean it when I say it's important. Like all these like stuff, like interesting ways you gotta wrangle the models to do the right thing in a specific situation, right? Like it is pretty fascinating, and I still again I really wonder on like the ability for all of us as our tools gets more and more adoption from agents to be able to give that kind of right context to those agents on how to use them, right? Like how will that end up looking like, and how many death threats or promises of tips will be in those instructions.
Yeah, totally. But I think that this could be something interesting, right? Because to some extent, that LLM having a level of knowledge, right, or like baked in kind of information, like you were saying, Connor, like it knows SQL, but then there is another like database that does something slightly different. And maybe instead of kind of going like, hey, this is learn all this SQL from scratch, we could kind of go like, oh, you're an agent, you're not a human being. All right, you know SQL, it's just like
Yeah.
that, except for these three differences, right? And
Yes.
you could almost go
Exactly.
like in kind of like just in time sort of fine tuning, right? Like say like just break
Yeah.
these three rules, everything else
Totally.
is fine. And it's the same thing like if you come to Weaviate documentation, because even for a person that comes in and learns about Weaviate, you come in and let's say you're a JavaScript developer, you never touched an LLM, so there's so much you need to learn, so much you need to read, right? But then you're an expert, you've done this and everything, you come in, they go like, oh, I just want to know how do I put my
Yeah.
vectors in, and how I run a near vector is completely different. And the same thing I think applies to agents. If an agent already has that knowledge, then we could always go like, okay, you know this thing, yes, you know this thing, yes, you know this thing, yes, you know, oh, this is new, okay, from now on I use this as a basis and let's move on, right?
It's very, very spot on, and something really interesting in how developer experience and how agent experience is fundamentally different, right? Like because with developer experience, you always have to assume this like you cannot assume a specific knowledge, right? Like we have to work in a lot of paths around like what if the person doesn't know about this at all, and this, and target all these registers from beginners in our areas to experts in our areas and so on, right? Like and the whole, and with agent experience it's very different, right? Like because you probably you know that there's this massive corpus of data and docs and information that's just part of the data set that you can kind of take for granted and give instructions around. You'll see that again, like for Bolt, it's another interesting example of this, right? Like because one of the things that's so strong around Bolt is this idea of web containers. They built this like really complex technology to be able to like transpile Node's apps to WebAssembly and run a whole Node app directly in the browser. That's sort of their development environment. And before AI in their product, they had the product stack blitz, right? Like as like team editing and so on. And it was very fast browser-based IDE because it runs directly in the browser. But with these like limitations of like node modules that depends on C binaries won't work. Like these specific, like if it tries to run JIP in an install path, it won't hurt, right? Like I think those limitations are really hard to teach every developer that comes and approach that tool, right? Like you gotta, like it's different from other, and some might get it easily, right? Like, but you've got to find a way to explain all of this to developers that might have very different knowledge of like what works in a WebAssembly environment and what not, and so on, right? Like, whereas once they have Bolt as an agent, they just need that prompt to do the minimal corrections to the knowledge of the agents to say like, can't use these type of things. You have to do it. It's very important that you follow these rules and so on, right? Like, but then it will do like once they get that right, it will do the right thing, and it'll work within that web container environment, and they'll get all the benefits, right? Like, and that's a great example of that level of difference in experience for an agent and experience for generic developers that really changes.
Yeah, that is so true. That is so true. And I think the one thing maybe that is better versus humans, like when we're talking about agents, there are no emotions involved, right? So they will never get like annoyed or anything, right? Like they will literally just go like, oh, they're not gonna go, oh, this is a stupid API. There's like, okay, you want me to do it this way? It's not how I was trained, but I'm gonna follow this and then do it, right? While if you work with engineers, like some of us are quite opinionated, and then some of us actually hold to our opinions pretty strongly as well, right? And that's while the agents kind of could be more malleable, right? Like at the time they go like, okay, I'll do it this one time and I'll stay quiet about it. So yeah, that's kind of cool. I had also like on a slightly different topic, like a thought of what if you could also have an ability for agents to leave feedback. So like you come in, you try to do something, and then they'll like 10 out of 10 would do it again, or failed miserably. Here is what I tried. Do better next time. You know, like no hard feelings, the proper Dutch way.
I'll wake up to all sorts of negative YouTube comments from agents.
NPS score for agents. Maybe that'll be the next thing.
Yeah. Or ANPS, right?
ANPS.
I love that.
Amazing. Well, Sebastian, thank you so much for joining the Weaviate Podcast. So awesome to have you on. And Matt, thank you so much for joining. Agent experience is such a fun conversation. To everyone listening, I hope you'll check out the article linked in the description. Thanks again.
Thank you.